Well, hello there, and welcome back to Pandemic Radio. On today's episode, we will be exploring the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, on the last lecture, we talked about emerging infectious diseases more generally, um, and then kind of got into zoonotic diseases more specifically. Now we're going to kind of take what we've learned and explore the science of where we think COVID 19 came from. And just as a general note, a lot of this information is still emerging, very much like the disease is still emerging. So, a lot of what I'll say is things like to the best of our knowledge, what we know so far. There's still a lot of pieces to be filled in and a lot of gaps to be explored. But I will do my best to put together uh, a coherent story of where we think the virus came from. So I want to start with this quote that I thought was pretty appropriate. Uh, Thomas Gillespie is a disease ecologist, so he studies the basically ecological or environmental origins of infectious diseases. He said, quote, "I am not at all surprised about the coronavirus outbreak. The majority of pathogens are still to be discovered. We are at the very tip of the iceberg." Ooh, pretty scary stuff. But he makes a good point. One, the fact that this pandemic is happening uh, was not a surprise to a lot of people who research this stuff, myself being one of them. The uncertainty is exactly where and what kind of virus or pathogen it's going to be. But researchers in this field have been speculating that another pandemic was inevitable, that it was probably going to come from animals, and so you know a lot of this was not a surprise, and the reason for that is because of the uh, accelerating changes to the environment that we've been witnessing, and we talked about that in the planetary health lecture. The other point he makes here is that the majority of pathogens have not been discovered. Uh, we live in a world of viruses, essentially. Um, some statistics say that viruses outnumber like cells by 10 to 1. So we are just surrounded by viruses. Go in the ocean, you're swimming in virus soup. Viruses are everywhere. Um, that's generally not a big issue for people because viruses uh, tend to kind of select for certain types of hosts. That's not always true, but usually, like just because you see a virus doesn't mean it's just going to infect everything it sees. Usually, it's more a specific relationship between a virus and a specific host. But we are just scratching the surface of discovering this giant pool of viruses, and new ones are being discovered and recognized all the time. And we're seeing that more and more in the last few decades. The number of emerging infectious diseases is increasing, and most of these emerging infectious diseases have an animal origin. And we can plot the risk of these emerging infectious diseases on a map. And this is where scientists and people that study these diseases feel that risk of a outbreak is highest. And this is another reason why we were not really surprised by the coronavirus outbreak occurring or beginning where it did, because as you can see from this map, it falls into one of these predicted risk areas. And the reason we're able to do this is because we've done a lot of research on the factors that contribute to these emerging infectious diseases, whether it's Ebola or Lyme disease or West Nile virus. and we find like common sets of risk factors, common sets of variables that explain uh, why they emerged. And a couple of the common themes are uh, tropical regions. So not always, but mostly these emerging diseases occur along the tropics. They happen in places with high biological diversity, so a lot of plants and animals. Again, not always true, but usually true. And they're happening in places with a lot of changes to landscapes. So human altered landscapes like agriculture, urbanization, deforestation, basically humans kind of manipulating the landscape. And this is causing uh, zoonotic diseases to emerge in human populations. Now, there are tons and tons of viruses, like I said. There are viruses that infect just animals, there are viruses that affect other viruses. Uh, there are just a huge sea of viruses. Okay, uh, they don't always just stay in their kind of little host area, though. They don't always just kind of stay in their little realm. Sometimes they change. Sometimes they evolve, and sometimes those viruses that infect animals start to infect people. And when that happens, that is called a zoonotic spillover event. So, zoonotic spillover is a precursor to pandemics like we're seeing now. And just because there's a zoonotic spillover event, just because like a certain virus makes the jump from animals to people, does not mean that it's going to necessarily become a pandemic. Because as we'll get into, there are some more kind of steps that need to occur for that to happen. And actually, this kind of spillover event happens more frequently than I think people realize. That there's these like little mini spillover events, these little kind of jumps from animals to people that are happening all over the world and happening pretty frequently. But they don't always then kind of take off the way that COVID has. But in general, you start off with a kind of group of viruses or pathogens, and then they tend to kind of have a particular animal host that they like to infect. So there are viruses that just kind of live in bats. There are viruses that are found in pigs and cows and mosquitoes. um, some viruses are more generalists, so they kind of can infect multiple things. Uh, but the spillover occurs when the virus, for example, that is in that bat, that is specialized to live and replicate within that bat, changes ever so slightly, and then all of a sudden now is able to start infecting people. Um, that is the spillover event. The next step towards pandemic is when that virus then is able to spread from person to person. So it's one thing to say that a virus can spread from a bat to a person. That's step one. Step two is that virus then able to spread from that person to another person, and uh, that's a whole nother system. So let's uh, let's take a little ecology lesson here, a little ecology break, and talk about ecological niches. So it looks like to the untrained eye that maybe you go off into a forest or you see kind of wild animals, and it looks like animals are all just kind of mixing together, and it's this big kind of animal free for all out there in the world. But actually, animals occupy very kind of narrow ecological ranges. So um, that's why you see birds, for example, with all different kinds of beaks. It's because they are adapted to survive and eat and live in a narrow range of like ecological conditions. Some birds, for example, seabirds, specialize in kind of eating and foraging around in the sand, some are out in the ocean, and then some are kind of in between. This is called the ecological niche that these birds occupy. And they don't really kind of deviate from that. They stay within their little zone. And just like animals have evolved and adapted to live in certain niches, so have viruses. And viruses typically will specialize in certain niches. And that's why not all viruses infect like every other creature, or why all viruses don't just jump into people. It's because usually viruses are adapted to one little specific area. And it actually takes quite a bit for that virus to escape its niche. To make that jump from one species to another is really not that easy, because viruses are not technically alive. They don't have motive. They just sort of exist. They occupy a niche because they can, and they have evolved over time to specialize within that niche. And you know, successful viruses, successful viruses meaning ones that are able to invade host cells and get them to replicate. Uh, they are well adapted to their little slice of the world. Um, for a virus to gain entry into a host cell, it's kind of like a lock and key. So the virus is kind of like a key, and the cell has to have a particular kind of a lock shape. And if that key fits the lock, then the virus is able to gain entry into the cell. Um, but that doesn't happen all the time. Uh, it then, like, once the virus is kind of inside, it needs to be able to elude the cell's defense system, and it needs to be able to basically trick the cell into producing new viruses, because that's basically what a virus is. It enters a cell. It takes over the machinery that tells a cell to replicate more of itself. So instead of saying uh, reproduce more cell, it says just kidding, reproduce more virus. And all of a sudden, these little cells become little virus factories, and they start spewing out tons and tons of duplicates of these virus. That ends up damaging the cell, and that's what ends up causing disease in the creature. Um, it takes uh, genetic changes or evolution in order for these changes to then make it into a new animal. So a virus, again, is kind of specialized to gain entry into a cell and then to trick the cell into replicating within a specific narrow ecological niche, uh, to then take that virus and expect it to do that same thing in a whole nother animal species like humans requires that the virus evolves or mutates or changes. And this kind of change, this kind of like evolution or mutation in the world of disease is called recombination. And you see it every single year with the flu, with seasonal flu. This is why you have to get new flu shots every year, and why sometimes you see pandemics of flu, because flu viruses, a lot of them are specialized to infect certain types of birds. It turns out, for whatever reason, pigs make really good, like, kind of virus blenders, kind of like virus mixing vessels. So different types of viruses from different types of animals can kind of, enter a pig and get kind of mixed together, and they get spit out basically as new types of virus. That's kind of putting it very simply, but that's why we get new um, types of flu viruses. And that's why some of them are called swine flu. But a lot of viruses end up getting kind of mixed around inside of pigs. And this is what we think happened with the current COVID SARS-CoV-2 virus. We think that this occurred starting in a bat population, and then it got kind of mixed around and changed to the point where now it can start infecting people. And again, like I said, this kind of mixing, this mutation to allow the virus to jump from animals or the reservoir host to people is really just step one. Once it gets into people, it then needs to be capable of spreading from person to person. And the better it is at spreading from person to person, the more likely a pandemic is to occur. So spillover events happen much more frequently than pandemic events. It's because on this graph, steps 2 and 3 are a lot harder than just step one. And we can look at this in different stages, and this is kind of a lot to take in, but there's some good reading on the course site about this, and I'll kind of go over this really kind of broadly. But this has to do with basically not all viruses end up spilling over and end up causing a pandemic. Some viruses just stay within their little ecological niche. They stay just within their little virus slice, their little kind of animal slice of the world. They end up just infecting certain types of animals, and they just kind of stay there. Occasionally, the virus spills over. It makes the little jump to another type of animal, including people. This is the spillover. Um, a lot of times, that's the end of it. It maybe mutates a little bit, and it's able to make the leap to person. Maybe the wrong bat met up with the wrong pig, and the wrong pig met up with the wrong farmer. And then the virus just didn't do anything from there. It just stopped at that farmer. Uh, that's in that case, the farmer is what's called a dead end host because the virus just stops there, it doesn't go anywhere. Um, Sometimes that farmer is then able to start spreading it to maybe his family. Uh, but then maybe it doesn't really go anywhere from there. So maybe it spreads to a few people, but for whatever reason, maybe they're kind of living in a rural area and they're not able to come into contact with more people. Um, Maybe it's just not that contagious. It doesn't really kind of get out and start spreading around like wildfire. And then sometimes the virus is able to gain a foothold into society and is able to start spreading rapidly. Um, and if you're wondering what the little R with the little zero, that's called the R naught, the basic reproductive number. And we're going to talk about that during the next module. That is an indicator of how contagious or how quickly a pathogen spreads. So look forward to that. So to sum it up, a virus can stay in the animals that it typically infects. Sometimes it can uh, spill over and just not go anywhere once it spills over. Sometimes it can lead to really limited, kind of small little outbreaks. And then sometimes it can become a pandemic. And there are a lot of different factors that influence whether a virus makes it from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4. Like a lot of things have to kind of line up and a lot of things have to kind of go a certain way for ultimately stage 4 to be reached. Um, because jumping from each stage is difficult. And What we're finding out basically is one really effective way to allow a virus to get from stage 1 to stage 4 is to basically increase the amount of contact between animal reservoirs and people. The more likely that a virus infected animal is to come into contact with a group of people, the more likely stage 4 is to be reached. It's kind of just like a probability risk thing. It's like flipping a coin over and over. Eventually, something's going to happen, right? Um, so this is where we get into things like, deforestation and uh, agriculture and even broader things like climate change. Um, these are all different ways of increasing the risk of spillover. And so we can look at it in terms of like the kind of factors that increase the prevalence of the reservoir. So like uh, the number of animals that could potentially be infected by the virus. For example, uh, industrial agriculture that puts a ton of pigs and cows together. Um, that's one way. So instead of having like one pig that could potentially harbor a virus, maybe you have 10,000 pigs. And a really good way of doing that is with these big uh, kind of livestock agriculture projects. Another way is by changing the landscape, maybe deforestation, and pushing animals together into new places. Maybe the climate is changing, so animals are more likely to live in certain areas. The other is the contact rate that I talked about. So, increasing the probability that a person is going to come into contact with an infected animal. Uh, One example, um, bushmeat hunting, we talked about. Another example could be people building communities or houses deeper into forests where they're just more likely to come into contact with animals. And then just increasing the probability of infection. So this is just a game of risk. It's a game of chance. It's like a coin flip. Just because you come into contact with an animal doesn't mean you're going to get a virus and that's going to start a pandemic. But the more likely you come into contact, the higher your odds. So it's like buying one lottery ticket versus buying a million lottery tickets. Your chances just change. Um, and so it's whatever is increasing that probability. It is whatever is buying quote unquote more like lottery tickets. So, coming into contact with animals more frequently, um, things like that. So we've been talking and hinting and kind of tiptoeing around this kind of environmental change angle. And again, this is why planetary health is such a great field for understanding this, because planetary health looks at the connections between environmental change and human health. And so this is a quote from the book Spillover. Quote, "We invade tropical forests and other wild landscapes, which harbor so many species of animals and plants, and within those creatures, so many unknown viruses. We cut the trees, we kill the animals, or cage them and send them to markets. We disrupt ecosystems and we shake viruses loose from their natural hosts. When that happens, they need a new host, and often we are it." And just a quick aside, to take a little Dr. Bale's book club break. The book Spillover by David Quayman is excellent reading. I have it on my bookshelf, and I recommend that you get it for your bookshelf. If any of this interests you, it is a great, uh, interesting, if not slightly terrifying, read. Uh, all about, spoiler alert, zoonotic spillover. So these changes to the environment, deforestation is one talked about a lot because it's a big one. Uh, it's what increases the contact between humans and these disease reservoirs, aka animals. Um, so this graph kind of breaks it down, I think, in a pretty accessible way. It shows that how we go from a group of animals. In the world of disease ecology, animals are called disease reservoirs. It's where the virus kind of lives and hangs out and comes from. Um, how does the virus ultimately get into people? Well, there's a number of different ways. Sometimes it takes like a mosquito or a tick. Sometimes the virus or pathogen can't can't make the jump on its own, so it needs a little friend, a little like insect friend to like help it get to the person. Um, Malaria, West Nile virus, Lyme disease. These are spread by insects, uh, and these are vector-borne uh, modes of transmission. If we are harvesting the animal reservoirs for food, this is that middle slaughter route. This is bushmeat hunting. This is large scale industrial livestock production. It is another way that we can become exposed. And then the excretion rate kind of route is when we are contributing to ways that the virus or the pathogen is able to basically be expelled from the animal reservoirs in greater numbers. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But anything that we do that allows one of these routes to open up or to become, um, you know, more likely to occur, that's what basically influences the probability of infection. So we talked about bushmeat hunting for diseases like Ebola, HIV. Uh, this is one way that the pathogen is able to make that journey from the animal reservoir to the person. Because if this baboon is infected with Ebola or some other virus, and if that virus maybe mutated just a little bit to be able to start infecting humans, there's not a lot standing in the way between the virus making the jump from this animal to this person. Um, Maybe that's, you know, moderate risk. So maybe if this just happens once, uh, not a big deal. But if this activity becomes more likely, becomes more common, you're just increasing the risk. Another way is wet markets. And with COVID-19, we've heard wet markets implicated in the spillover event. And it's because it's been implicated, these kinds of markets have been implicated in um, other zoonotic spillover events. Wet markets are basically markets, farmers markets that bring bushmeat animals in, typically alive, in small cages for sale. So you have a lot of people and a lot of animals kind of crammed together in small spaces. It's a really good way of mixing um, possible reservoirs of disease with people. And then deforestation is the other big one that we keep talking about because this increases the opportunity for pathogens to move from animals to people. So let's get into the coronaviruses. Uh, COVID-19, the 2019 novel coronavirus. Not the first coronavirus, as it turns out. There are others. Actually, there are 7 others that infect people. Uh, 7 that infect people. There are many, many, many more that have yet to infect people. There are many coronaviruses out there. These are the 7 that we know about that have made that jump to infect people. 4 of them are considered common human coronaviruses. They are not very pathogenic. They do not generally cause severe disease in people. Think of it as more of a common cold kind of a thing. The other 3 human coronaviruses are highly pathogenic coronaviruses. This includes COVID-19. This includes SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome. And this includes MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. Um, these are all relatives of each other, kind of the keeping up with the COVID joke. Uh, they are all part of the same kind of coronavirus family, but they are distinct viruses um, that have branched off from a kind of common viral ancestor. What we know about the 3 highly pathogenic coronaviruses is that they all share a common animal reservoir. And research suggests that this is the bat. Um, Evidence suggests that spillover events contributed to each of these pandemics, and it all started with a bat, and most likely involved an intermediate host. So the virus couldn't just go straight from the bat to the person, it had to uh, go through another animal to help it evolve to the point where it could infect people. Now, MERS, SARS, and COVID-19 again are all part of the same coronavirus family. They're closely genetically related to each other, um, and they've all occurred since the year 2000. So SARS happened in 2002, 2003. You can see the distribution of where it went. Um, I believe the last count worldwide was less than 10,000 cases. MERS started in 2012, and I think technically is still going on. It originated in Saudi Arabia and spread to a handful of other countries, but certainly not. Neither of these have spread to the extent that COVID-19 has spread. And this is part of the investigation and the puzzle that's still going on is why did COVID spread so much more prolifically? Like why did COVID really outpace both SARS and MERS, despite the fact that all of them probably came from bats and all were so kind of closely related to each other? That's part of the mystery still to be solved. And again, what we're realizing is the role that bats play as the animal reservoir in all 3 of these highly pathogenic coronavirus diseases. This is an article that was published in 2017. So this was a little uh, pre-pandemic foreshadowing that researchers were looking to basically find the reservoir for SARS, which was the first really bad coronavirus pandemic that occurred in 2002. And they found some bat caves in China where they were discovering these coronaviruses that they predicted had the potential to make the jump to people. And based on these findings, they said, okay, we think that bats were the cause of the SARS pandemic. And based on the stuff we're seeing in these bats, we think another outbreak could happen. And look where we are now. So bats play a pretty critical role in understanding the origin. And again, when we want to understand the origin, a big part of what we're trying to do is trying to predict and prevent the next one. So we're getting a better idea of the role that bats play as the primary animal reservoir, and you know what role these intermediate animals possibly play. So with SARS, the intermediate animal, the animal that was like the kind of go between, was the civet cat. Uh, if you don't know what one of those looks like, I encourage you to Google it. They're pretty they're beautiful animals, but they are heavily trafficked in the wildlife trafficking industry. So they are exploited in the wildlife trafficking world, which is one of the precursors that we just talked about that increases risk of spillover. MERS is thought to have passed from bat to camels and into people. And then COVID is still under investigation, but we have some idea, we have some clues as to what that in between animal was. So I like this quote from the San Diego Zoo's Research Institute. They said, a virus can be a bit like toothpaste. Once it gets out, it's hard to put back. Now that the coronavirus responsible for this pandemic is out and has spread around the world, we are not going to be able to put it back where it belongs or make it go away. And the blame game has begun. Whose fault is this anyway? So a lot of people were quick to try to come up with possible origins. That this was a virus that maybe escaped from a research lab. That was an early popular uh, kind of belief that people suspected that scientists were doing research on this type of coronavirus and that it escaped from a lab, and then that's what allowed it to spread into a pandemic. Um, some of this was grounded in a bit of truth in that, yes, researchers in China and other parts of the world have been doing research on coronaviruses, but that's because COVID-19 is not the first coronavirus disease to occur. There have been others like SARS and MERS that have been and are being studied. Um, so it's partly true that yes, coronaviruses are in labs being studied, but the consensus is that this did not occur from a laboratory release, that this did have a natural origin, and that this natural origin was a bat reservoir. So I like this quote from this is a Dr. Susan Murray is a wildlife veterinary medical officer. Um, she said, "quote The only way I can see this virus coming from a test tube is if there was a bat inside that test tube." Um, the consensus again is that this was not man-made, that this did not come from a lab, that this was the result of a natural spillover event from a bat population. And so here's what we think we know about the coronavirus transmission cycle. Uh, we have scientific consensus that the reservoir host was a bat population, that the virus needed to go through an intermediate host to begin infecting people. That intermediate host, clues are pointing and evidence is pointing to an animal called the pangolin, but that has yet to be definitively kind of classified. We do know that the spillover event happened and that the virus adapted to spread from not just a few people, but to many people. It became contagious enough to spread to many people, thereby becoming a pandemic. So again, the bat has been implicated as a culprit in this zoonotic emerging infectious disease. And a lot of people, I think, are quick to place blame on the bat, like it is the bat's fault. Uh, but just a quick little note in support of the bat is how critical bats are for ecological health, and what is good for ecological health is good for human health. Bats are pollinators. Bats keep insect populations in check so we don't get outbreaks of other diseases. But they do harbor these viruses. And I would make the argument that it's not the bats' fault that we got the virus from them. It's really our fault for manipulating the environment in a way that put us in more contact with them. So why do bats have this kind of ability, or why do bats seem to be the common culprit? Um, well, here's a few ways, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's what we know about bats. The way that they eat, they tend to like spit out some of their food. So when they're like eating fruit, for example, they kind of like eat the good bits. They like suck out the nectar and juice, and then they kind of like spit out the rest that they don't want. So if another animal kind of comes along, maybe like a pig, and eats the uh, leftovers off the ground, it could also be ingesting virus particles from the bat, um, and that gives the virus an opportunity to make the next step into a new host. Uh, Bats and humans tend to overlap a lot in the places they live. So the more that people and bats come into contact with each other, the more likely a spillover event is to occur. Um, Bats and humans are coming into increased contact with each other uh, because humans are building communities further into areas where bats have lived. Um, we're also changing a lot of the existing landscape where bats have lived and changing them into like livestock operations. So all of a sudden now where you had a forest where bats lived, now you have a forest with some livestock that allows people, bats, and other animals to mix together. Bats are gregarious, or can be, meaning they're all friendly and they like to hang out with each other. They're sociable. So they tend to clump together in large groups. And that's one of the criteria for increasing spillover risk. You have a lot of them together. That's like buying a lot of lottery tickets for the pandemic. And then some bats can migrate a long ways. So they can, if they do have viruses, they are capable of spreading them around to far areas. This is the pangolin, the intermediate host that is suspected or suspected of being the intermediate host. That the virus made its way from a bat to this little critter and then into a human. The reason this occurred is, well, you don't probably think, well, like, why is this guy hanging out with a bat? Uh, Probably didn't happen naturally. Probably happened because um, bats are harvested and sold in wet markets. They are, um, coming into contact with people more and more. And these little guys are actually the most trafficked animal in the world. They are used for their scales. They're used for their meat. They are uh, harvested from forests and sold more than any other mammal in the world. So the evidence suggests that we are bringing bats and other animals like this little guy together, and we are forcing the virus to mix together with different animals. So this quote I liked from Science magazine says that, quote, unchecked exploitation of wildlife, which is what the pangolin trade is, whether for sustenance or profit, legal or illegal, puts humans in direct contact with myriad unfamiliar species. So basically, we're just mixing them all together. Increased contact occurs in the global practice of bushmeat and game hunting and in wildlife farms, which often unsustainably and illegally supply wildlife for consumption or trade. Imported, hunted, and farmed wildlife then reach a common endpoint, which often is wildlife markets. There, animals endure debilitating and immunocompromising conditions that promote disease transmission. They are packed in cages with poor biosecurity and unhygienic shedding of animal excreta. Direct human wildlife contact, mixing of non endemic wildlife species, and limited health and safety standards are all criteria for a zoonotic hotspot. So, put simply, we are harvesting animals, putting them all together, and we're doing it more and more frequently. This is a recipe for a pandemic. So, a question we ask ourselves is COVID-19 a symptom of a sick planet? Um, is this evidence that how we're changing the environment is seriously impacting our health in negative ways? And more, we are learning to quantify changes to forest ecosystems, for example. This is a map of deforestation in West Africa. The areas in red are where there was once forest and now there's not forest anymore. Uh, these areas have been the location of recent Ebola outbreaks. Um, this shows that the more that we degrade forest ecosystems, the more likely these spillover events are to occur. So, the environmental degradation of natural ecosystems has resulted in many negative health outcomes, one of which is outbreak of infectious diseases. So, it doesn't always have to be pandemics, but that's a big one. So, deforestation, for example, destroys this kind of delicate balance that forest ecosystems create. And by destroying these delicate balances, we increase the contact between humans and reservoirs of disease. A nice, healthy forest ecosystem helps buffer or protect us against spillover events. And failing to recognize this, that the forest has a value, that this ecosystem service of protecting us from disease outbreaks means that if we continue to accelerate deforestation, the disease outbreaks are likely to continue at increasing rates. Uh, I would argue that if we do not change these practices after COVID-19, we can and will expect to see another pandemic. So, new infectious diseases are unfortunately inevitable. We live on a virus filled world. There are viruses everywhere. Uh, Disease is going to happen, but pandemic calamities do not have to happen. Uh, the COVID-19 that we are seeing, uh, that is not an inevitable fate. That is not something we have to live with. It did not need to happen, and it does not need to happen again. So here's where we go from studying the origins of pandemic to what do we do about it? Prediction and prevention. And with the planetary health framework, we are redefining what we mean by disease prevention. And this includes more upstream solutions that protect the environment. So it's not just about trying to come up with like a cure for a viral disease, but it's about trying to prevent the viral disease from escaping in the first place. So, for example, forest protection efforts should be added to the tools that we use to fight disease. So, when you think of public health and you think of, medicine, we need to put things like forest protection in there as public health tools, because these solutions can have a lot of different benefits, and we're just kind of realizing a lot of these. It doesn't just have to be pandemics, But if we preserve a forest, for example, we are preserving watersheds, and this improves water and increases the amount of clean water to nearby communities. So that reduces a whole number of other diseases. And here's the upstream, kind of downstream analogy. And if you've never heard of this, or if you're new to uh, public health and planetary health and pandemic prevention is about upstream thinking rather than downstream thinking. And here's what that means. So, this is a little story to help you kind of wrap your head around that. A man and a woman were fishing on the riverbank when they saw a woman struggling in the current. So, they rescued her. Soon after they rescued her, they saw another guy, another man maybe floating down the river, struggling. They rescued him too. This continued all afternoon. They just kept seeing people floating down the river. They would swim out, rescue them, and then they would have to go back and rescue more because more and more people just kept floating down the river. Where are all these people coming from? Who keeps throwing all these people in the river? So they decide to go up the river and find out, like, what's going on. Why are all these people floating down the river? We're tired of rescuing them out of the river. So they discover this really beautiful overlook along the river's edge, but it didn't have any warning signs. It didn't have any protective barriers. So they went to the community leaders and they said, "Hey, uh, we need to do something about this because we keep rescuing all these people that are falling into the water. Um, what if we put up some like guardrails and some warning signs? Um, this prevents the people from falling into the river in the first place, so we don't have to just keep rescuing them downstream." So this is the upstream approach. And part of our upstream planetary health solution is is predicting these spillover events. And just to sum up, again, this can be um, difficult, but what we know is that a lot of this is influenced by how we are changing the environment. So, what does this kind of prevention, pandemic prevention and prediction look like in real life? Um, Possibly one of the coolest job titles ever, the virus hunters. Uh, there are researchers from around the world, there are different organizations who are trying to find these viruses um, at their source, at the animal reservoir, either before or right at the source of their spillover. So one group is called the Eco Health Alliance, and they've really been at the forefront of researching the origin of coronaviruses. So this is some researchers from the Eco Health group in a cave in China. Uh, they are looking for new pathogens in bats. Um, and they're hoping to find new pathogens or viruses in bats that look like they have the potential to make the jump into people. There is a large US government funded project called the USAID Predict project. And it's basically taking a lot of these virus hunting projects and keeping track of them from around the world. So to date, the Predict group has screened hundreds of thousands of animals and humans, and they have found over 900 new viruses in zoonotic hotspots. So these are 949 potential pandemic viruses that they have discovered and are documenting. A lot of university institutions are adopting this prevention way of thinking, this pandemic prevention. So one of the leaders is right in our backyard. UC Davis has the One Health Institute. So if you want to look this up and if this kind of thing interests you, check them out. They've been really at the forefront of this. One Health is a way of looking at the health of animals, humans, and the environment, and figuring out ways of preventing pandemics is one big part of that. And then here at Dominican University, we are also taking part in the planetary health movement. We are going to begin offering a new minor in planetary health in the fall of 2020. We have planetary health courses. You're taking one right now. We have another where we look at planetary health issues in Costa Rica every summer. And then there are student faculty research opportunities in planetary health. Uh, See Dr. Bales if you are interested in exploring any and all of these. So that's it. That's what we know so far about the origins of COVID-19 and why it's so important to understand the origins so that we can stop the next pandemic. This was a broad overview, and I would really strongly encourage you to go through a lot of the readings to read more in detail about a lot of the points that I raised here. This was like the overall Cliff Notes, like table of contents version. But a lot of the readings are really good and accessible and interesting. And I would encourage us, again, to be thinking once the dust settles uh, and we can wrap our heads around the scope of the COVID-19 pandemic, that we don't forget that pandemics are preventable, and that we start shifting our resources to understanding where they came from. All right, so that's it. I will see you guys next time, and until then, this is Dr. Bales signing off.